handed men hit over half their backhands, not only with closed stances, but with extreme closed stances on balls where they truly have a chance to decide. Or would you be surprised if I told you that on the one-handed backhand, the percentage of extreme closed stances was even higher? Or would you be surprised if I told you it's totally different for the women? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. A lot less extreme closed stance, more neutral stance, and way, way more open stance. And why would that be? So, I think we're all more than aware that for the last few years there's been an ongoing discussion, if not arguments leading to fistfights on what constitutes, quote, modern tennis. And much of that discussion has focused on the forehand. And a key element in that discussion on the forehand has been stances, and particularly open stances, right? But little analysis really has been made about what's happening on the backhand side. So how is it that I could say that, oh gee, you know, modern tennis, well, we all know that's open stance, but except on the backhand where it's the complete opposite. I don't think we have anybody here today, tell me if I'm wrong, that would advocate an extreme closed stance forehand at this point. So I think that when I started to look at this, I kind of went, huh, wow. I tried to figure out why. And after looking at a lot of footage from a lot of angles of a lot of players, I think the really interesting thing is that this may sound counterintuitive, but I hope to convince you when we look at the footage. The way the closed stance functions on the backhand generates the same kind of advantage that the open stance generates on the forehand, and that is increased torso rotation in the hips and shoulders. So again, we're going to see that, you know, there is no one answer. There's plenty of open stance backhands hit by the men. There's plenty of neutral stance backhands. The women hit closed, neutral, and open as well. So there's no simple answer, but I think it's really interesting to look at what the preference seems to be when these guys have a choice about what they can do, and then to see how that varies with the women. And I did rewind the tape this time, so. It may not be what you think. So let's start now by talking about, to get a comparative framework, let's start with the forehand stances. What would you call that stance? Semi-open, right? And if you look at the line, you could see that there is about a 30 to 45 degree line across the toes to the baseline. And the outside foot is substantially closer to the net, more forward, right? And why is that? Because it facilitates the massive upper body turn. And then we can see that what happens in the forward swing, that the shoulders are turning 90 degrees plus in the preparation, and then they're rotating 90 degrees, sometimes 90 degrees plus in the forward swing. And yeah, you definitely do still see this neutral stance, but that tends to be on lower and shorter balls. And it's not true to say that guys with conservative grips hit more neutral stance in their regular balls, because they don't. They tend to hit semi-open as well. So this neutral stance is a variation having to do with ball position and court height in general. You know, not on every ball. Now, here's something interesting. And I think this has actually changed in Andy's game. What would you call that stance? A lot closer to fully open, right? His feet, this foot isn't so far forward, the heels are pretty close to parallel with the baseline, right? And if you were going to criticize Andy's forehand, one thing you might say would be that he doesn't have quite as much coil in the hips, because he tends to default into that more extreme open stance. So here's another look at, and you can see how hard these guys will work to align the feet to get into that angled semi-open stance. Okay, so here's the thing about contact height, and this is, again, it's the stance. Okay, so Nadal's what, 6'1", right? So the ball is a little bit above his shoulder. He's what, about a foot off the ground. If he was just standing there, you know, that would probably be bouncing over his shoulder at about the level of his bandana. And so you do see Andy be a little bit more semi, but in general, he tends to be a little bit more open. It's just interesting. It's just interesting. You know, here's a different initial step. What would you call this first step with the right foot, or the inside foot, or the outside foot, I should say, on Novak's forehand? Drop step, yeah. Right? Gravity step, actually stepping backward. But look here. I mean, that's a massive amount of coiling, isn't it? So, you know, open stance is all about, semi-open stance is all about contact height and coiling and uncoiling, right? That's a more typical stance for Fed. See the flip? You guys want to go back and look at that since we've been talking about it?
And it looked like Andy didn't have a flip on his forehand.
He has less flip because he takes his arm further back. Yeah, but look at that flip. See that? And so we're going to say that he turbocharged his shoulder on that one, or he turbocharged something. Okay, so now let's get to the topic at hand. And let's look at, get my notes right here. Let's look at the variations on the backhand. That one's closer to neutral. Here's an open stance one. We should say semi-open stance, right? That one's definitely neutral. this one is definitely closed. So I did some counting, and what I found was that well over half the backhands, when they seemed to have the opportunity to choose, were hit with that extreme close stance. So let's look again here at the shoulder rotation on the forehand. Right, about 90 degrees or a little bit more to the contact. Now let's look at it on the one-handed backhand. Okay, so we can see that on the forehand there's 90 degrees of rotation roughly from the turn to the contact. Right, on the one-handed backhand, the guys aren't open at contact. They tend to be, usually a little past, but something close to perpendicular with the shoulders, right? Okay. So, is the two-handed backhand really a left-handed forehand, as I was discussing with someone a little bit earlier, or is it something else? And I say it's something else. I'm saying a two-handed backhand for the men is a two-handed backhand. All right? And if you look at the angle of the shoulders, that they are universally somewhere in between the shoulder position that you would see on a forehand and a one-handed backhand. Okay? This back shoulder never gets fully parallel to the net as it would if the person were hitting a true modern left-handed forehand. Look at this stance. Neutral stance, same deal, right? Look at this angle, right? Now, let's look at the hitting arm structure. Nobody's arm really totally is a straight line. Like if you look at mine, you can see that little curve. Okay, most people's arms have some curve in them. That elbow joint, though, is as straight as it gets, or very close. So this is what we call bent straight. Okay, front arm is bent, back arm is basically straight, and that's the dominant hitting arm structure on the men's pro tour. And notice here, even on the open stance or the semi-open stance, the shoulder position still doesn't get fully open like it would on a forehand. Why? Because it's a two-handed backhand. And you know what? If you've been saying for years that, hey, two-handed backhand, that's a left-handed forehand, I'm with you. I wrote that in 2 versions of my book, right? So, this is something, and that is a legitimate version of the two-handed backhand, as we're going to see. But this is something that, again, probably without this footage would be very difficult to say conclusively that was true.
John, maybe you opened up an advancement that you can bring around, that if the two-hander can get those shoulders around parallel, then there's another level.
Well, there are plenty of players in the women's side that do that, okay?
There's a lot of women's backhands that would probably hang with the men.
I think it's a perfectly legitimate variation, okay? I think that what you're seeing is in the men's game is that, and again, this goes back to, okay, there wasn't some book that was passed around to all these players, right? All of them have been in this two-handed mode where it's a pull-push, right? And we're going to see that this is grip dependent. For whatever reason, all the men have come to the same thing on their own, intuitive, genius, call it what you will, where they're using that front arm. And I've looked and searched for a man who had the bent variation, and the last one I could find was Goran Ivanisevic. Wow. I thought maybe Golbus was going to be, but it turns out no.
Backhand?
What's that?
Is backhand not a bent?
We got to go on tennisplayer.net and figure that out. Could be. we can answer that question, one. Okay, so this will be my one illegal pitch because I'm not supposed to try to sell product. But all this footage exists and thousands more clips on Tennis Player, and you can get it if you go there the first month free. And if you're a USPTA, you can pay 1/3 what the normal subscription price is. Just FYI.
Can I add a little bit more, John?
Go ahead.
Another thing I really like about it is he's got front view clips, side view clips, rear view clips, where you can see a player and see from and he'll have multiple versions of it. And like you've said, I was talking with Charles earlier about it, that depends on the ball coming at him, determines what's coming back. So you can't always see all of that, but you still get a lot of different views, which I think is very helpful too.
I mean, and what we're getting here is like my take on the footage, and you guys may have a slightly different take. I said this would be my only plug, but I'll make one more. There's about 50 other guys writing on the site, you know, not all of whom agree with me. And that's one of the things, by the way, you want to submit an article, email me, you know, that I don't think, you know, the more footage I've looked at, the less I realize I know. And I think that one thing that we can do as a profession is collaborate better to have healthy discussion. And, you know, it's like, you know, I say it sort of as a joke, but not really. People ask me questions all the time that I don't know, but I file them away. I'll go look at Baghdad's hitting on position. So let's look at the grip dependencies here. By the way, is that a flip? But that's a good view of the grip. So what you see in the men is some version of a mild backhand grip. You know, you can call it mild Eastern, you can call it continental, you can call it whatever you want. But some version of a backhand grip with the bottom hand where the index knuckle is probably on bevel 2 and the heel pad is, if not square on top, at least partially on top, okay? And guess what? That would allow you to hit a drive flat one-handed backhand. So there you get a good look. That backhand, bottom hand grip can be paired with either an Eastern or a slight semi-Western. You can see Rafa is more on the semi-Western side there. That knuckle is probably about on bevel 4. So interesting there, you can see Novak's heel pad isn't, you know, square on top, but it's partially on top. And you can see that his top hand, his knuckle is a little bit higher. There you can see it. Maybe not quite as strong with this hand, right? But definitely more Easternish with the bottom hand. And would that go with the idea of standing in and taking it a little earlier? I think so. But that seems to be the range. Similar with Murray, very mild, but definitely some version of a backhand grip. And then the heel pad, you know, basically right behind the back bevel in line with the racket head. Good look at the grip right there. Look at the shoulder position. Okay, so these are slight differences, but slight must be significant at this level. What we're going to look at here is the difference in the coiling and the uncoiling in the two-handed backhand with the different stances. And looking at a large number of these is where I came up with a hypothesis about the increased uncoiling in the closed stance. Okay, so neutral, take a look at that line. Here's closed. What do you think? Is there more shoulder turn? Okay, that makes sense, doesn't it? Because if we look at this line across the feet, the line of the shoulders is going to approximate the line along the line of the feet. So when you turn and step diagonally across, it's natural for your upper body to also turn more. Neutral, and that's a great turn. There's nothing wrong with that turn. Close. A little bit more, isn't it? Look at the hips also. Okay, so now look at open. Pretty good. Probably not quite as much as closed. Could be slightly more than neutral. Okay, so now let's just look at the uncoiling. Right? Watch the hips and the shoulders. So they're coming from the maximum turn and then rotating through, less than open at contact, going to all the way open at some point in the finish. So look at this right here. If we stop it, imagine there's that semi-closed position that they came a little bit further from that closed stance turn. Now, the other factor to look at, because the coiling looks pretty good on the open stance, right? The other factor we're going to look at, and we'll see it very clearly in this sequence, is the legs. So same deal, let's just look at him in all three stances, in the coiling and the uncoiling. Okay, so, looks pretty similar to Andy. That's a great turn, obviously. Look at the bend in the knee. Definitely he's got some coiling in the legs. So, two things. Again, 20%, you pick the number, more coiling in the upper body, but also look, because of the extra width of the stance, the extra coiling in the legs. Neutral, close. And now look again that the body turn looks really good, but this foot is not going to be part of the equation as much in the uncoiling because of where it is in that semi-open stance. If it was a forehand, it would be different because the shoulders would be rotating so much more, okay? What I'm saying is that the uncoiling of the front leg in the closed stance is a big factor on the two-handed backhand.
So John, are all these predicated by how well they can get to the ball? So would you say they're going to go neutral if they're easily getting to the ball, or could it be any of these?
Great question. I would say that around the center of the court, slightly to the backhand side, you see more neutral. In the backhand side, you see more closed. On the defensive, you see some open. So it's to some extent that, but what I see in the footage is whenever possible, it's not a function of, oh, I had to do this. It's that I want to do this. I want to get into this closed stance position. And when we get to the one-handed backhand, I'll show you an amazing clip of Tommy Haas actually jumping into a closed stance when he certainly didn't have to.
Okay.
So again, we'll just compare the uncoiling. So shoulders are going to rotate, legs definitely going to straighten out. That's a great backhand. Okay? And by the way, a neutral stance backhand is probably the model for 99% of the people, or at least 90% of the people we're working with. But again, it's really important, I think, to understand what's going on at this level in order to know how to translate it or to know whether it applies at all the other levels.
John, is it just me, or why his hands don't touch on the backhand? He seems to have a gap.
He does. What do you make of that? So does some of the women. You hear people say that, oh, that's going to help, or you hear people say that that's not going to help. It doesn't seem to be hurting him a lot.
Federer has
The girl that
2
worked with
inches
me
of
that had
gap,
the best
I think.
backhand.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a gap.
She had about 4.
So,
Yeah, exactly.
She was top 10 in the country.
I don't know. So just to look at what I do think I know, look at the legs, more shoulder turn, more knee bend, so more uncoiling into the ball. And one of the interesting things that we are going to add at the Open, I'm co-presenting with Dave Ramos from the USTA, and he is going to actually coordinate the stance numbers from the 2013 final and how many percentage of which stances were hit by all 4 players. So what that would be Serena, Azarenka, Novak, and Nadal. Isn't that right? So again, great looking backhand, less front leg involvement. Okay. Neutral. There's an outside racket position, mini dog pat, big flip. Same thing on the 2 that we were looking at. There's the closed coil. There's neutral. There's closed. Oops, I guess I didn't go back to closed. So, are you guys seeing that? Are you seeing the same thing I am? That there's more body coiling in general? You can find an example to match anything. But if you look at dozens and dozens of them, I think that this is the clear tendency. Great upper body. Oh, there it is.
John, with all your contacts,
Who says I have contact? Yeah.
the
Okay.
right-handed, left-handed, is Rafa truly right-handed and learned to play left-handed, or what is that story?
I don't know. I know what you know. You know that
We don't know if he can serve right-handed?
I don't know if he can. Yeah.
I'm just curious.
Yeah. I mean, it is. You know. I mean, is Uncle Tony an idiot savant? I mean, you know, if could he have really dominated Roger if he'd had to hit, you know, right-handed forehands to Roger's forehand? I don't know. These guys, by the way, are the most closed of any group on the tour. You just, you know, there's a stone wall that you just cannot breach. Recovery step from the closed stance. Crossover. Or from the neutral. So same here, right? Watch that front knee uncoil, and the shoulders are coming from, I mean, maybe this is overkill to look at all three players, but I think it's very interesting that you see such clear similarities. And again, it isn't because, you know, Rafa called up Andy and said, hey, I'm loving the closed stance two-handed backhand. Right? I just like looking at it. Hope you guys feel the same. You know, so yeah, closer to the center of the court. You will see more of this, but not always.
What about contact point? How is that impacted by the stance?
Great question. I mean, you know, is there some slight difference in the angles? There might be. You know, again, you're asking me a question that I'm like, I should probably think about that. But, you know, what is this angle? Is that 30 degrees? You know, what I found is when you move the camera around, one camera will see 30 degrees, one will see 45, but, you know, definitely that's not an open shoulder position, but it's more open than a one-handed backhand, right? So it's not a left-handed forehand, it's not a one-handed backhand, it's a two-handed backhand, and that intermediate rotational position of the shoulders is normative. So now, okay, now he's a little further out. You know, could have he taken another step over there to get neutral if he really wanted to? I think so. Look again, you know, just at the relationship between the back foot recovery. Look at where the back foot is in relationship to the swing before the recovery step. I think that's really important. And in fact, one of the things that if you start to look at these, you'll see is that on most of the backhands, both the 1 and the 2, rather than swinging around in the forward swing, that back foot actually kicks back away either towards the baseline or even the opposite sideline. And that must have something to do with the uncoiling of the body and not having it happen too soon. So again, I don't see any baseline there, right? This play, you know, makes a lot more sense when you're that far back in the court. Okay, so you guys with me? What do you think of that? Did that surprise anybody? Did you feel like, oh, I already knew that, or do you say like, you know, that can't be? I mean, any feedback there on what you think about that closed stance? No one wants to say. Okay.
I don't want to do all the talking. What are you taking?
Okay, you're nodding. I'll take that. So now, you know, how could it be the same on the one-handed back? Okay. So let's just look. Okay, again, pretty close to the center of the court. Look at the back foot go back there, which is characteristic. So that's a neutral. It's a great backhand, obviously. I just had to take it all the way to the palm there. If you like that. All right, and now here's the close. If he wanted to hit that neutral, he could have. So again, look at the spread in the stance, right? And look at the increase in the shoulder turn. And open. So don't get me wrong, right? Even though the open stance is less prevalent on the one, it is hit regularly. Again, I don't see the baseline, right?
It's the bulkhead right there.
I think he's strong in his legs. So let's just compare them again. And again, and maybe this is overkill, but this is how I work through to get to this conclusion. Look at the angle of the shoulders, a little bit past square to the net. Now look at the closed. That's a big difference, huh?
Isn't there a lot bigger of a difference between the stance and the two-handed backhand?
Maybe so. I mean, I think the width of the stance in the one tends to be wider.
John, do you have any video of Wawrinka's one-handed backhand and how that compares to Rogers? Because I know at the Australian Open this year, his backhand was insane. I mean, he was ripping winners all over everyone.
Yeah, I do. There's some on the site. We don't have as much of him as we would like, but there definitely are a bunch of clips of him. And, you know, the basic difference is in the grip structure and all that that entails, you know, because he definitely is more on top of the handle and actually slightly behind. And the characteristics of that swing are gonna be a preference for a higher contact point, a contact point that has to be a little further in front, and more hip and shoulder rotation through the motion. So again, same deal. If you saw there, you know, good shoulder coil. Now let's watch the uncoiling. Shoulders are rotating a little bit, right? But at contact, he's basically square like we saw in that very first one. Now watch how much more hip and shoulders to get to the contact. And so that's what I'm saying, is that these great athletes are feeling that from the closed stance, they are able to coil and unload on the ball, although I'm sure they probably couldn't put it into those words. So Wawrinka would be more like Gasquet or and you know, similar. So so here's a fun one. Watch him actually hop. Okay, he could step over there and get neutral. Watch what he does. Right? Somehow he's feeling that he likes the strength of that position more, and so he's working to get that position. And then again, when he gets there, shoulders are, you know, a little past perpendicular, but look how much they rotated to get to that classic position where we think of the shoulders as staying much more sideways on a one-handed backhand than on a forehand or a two-handed backhand. Okay, so now just run through on the slice and we see it's exactly the same thing. Right, look at the turn, the wide stance. Sideways at contact, but having rotated a little more into the shot to get to that contact position. All right, so now let's just switch it over. Definitely with the women, you do see the same thing. Big turn, wider stance, close stance step. Look how high that ball is and how well she controls it. But that's more of an exception, and typically you see when they step in more of a neutral stance or a slightly less wide closed stance. And the key to understanding this, I think, is in the hitting arms. Okay, so we saw with the men that the back arm was basically straight. When we get to the women, watch the bend in the elbow. Okay, so that's like a double bend forehand. Now, with Azarenka and Sharapova, they have got the mild backhand grips like the men. Here's an open stance, Sharapova. And that's common, but look that little shift to a mild backhand grip, and then more or less an Eastern forehand on the bottom hand. Now watch this, just a good look at it. This is the characteristic women's hitting arm structure, both arms bent. And that contact point is going to be a little closer in to the body in 2 dimensions, a little closer this way and a little closer this way, less in front and closer into the body.
You said Eastern forehand and the bottom hand, you meant top hand, right?
Yeah, I meant top hand, thank you. Mild backhand on the bottom hand. Now, let's go to the other end of the spectrum here, right? Extreme open stance. Look at the grips, right? I don't know what I call that. That's like Don Budge's forehand grip, right? Definitely the heel pad hasn't, you know, the index knuckle might be on bevel 2, but the heel pad is 2. So she hasn't got that last bit of shift, right, that makes it some version of a backhand or a continental grip. And I looked at 60 or 65 of these, and there is not, there's another gapper. There is not one of them that she hits other than open stance. So this would be, at the other end of the extreme, the true lefty forehand, two-handed backhand. And, you know, there's a story Rick Macy likes to tell about this, you know, where people were watching 12-year-old Venus or where, she didn't step into her backhand. You know, you gotta fix that. And Rick said, well, you know, I think she's hitting her backhand pretty well. So, you know, again, how did this happen? Maybe Richard Williams didn't understand backhand grips, I don't know. But maybe it's something that Venus just felt. You see a little bit more stance variation with Serena, but again, look at the grip structure, right? I mean, she might be slightly more on top, but I still would call it even a continental grip. And there's the bent left arm. And look at the difference in the shoulder position, right? As you were saying, with this variation, the shoulder action is going to be increased. The leg action is going to be decreased. You know, maybe it's 2 ways to skin a cat. What's interesting is the difference between the men and the women, and what that really means. I mean, and people say, well, it's the ratio of shoulder width to hip width. I don't know.
These are left-handed forehands, no?
These are much more, I mean, I don't think they're completely left-handed, but far more, and you can tell that because of the grip structure and the rotational pattern, right? Conclusions. I left that part blank. What do you guys think? All right, you're not going to say. So, I mean, what I would say is it's the same general principle we were talking about before. You know, there's a big universe out there with a lot of variations. There seem to be clear differences between the men and the women. On the men, I think it would be a mistake not to teach the bottom hand grip shift, you know. On the women, maybe it doesn't matter, but Is it hurting? I mean, Sharapova and Azarenka have pretty good backhands. Are you going to say that, you know, Venus and Serena have better backhands because of that more extreme left-handed technique, or is it because they're Venus and Serena? You know, what if they had, you know, a stronger grip? I don't know. My basic point is, it's a complex world out there. The more we understand about the world, then the more informed decisions we can make in working with other people. Questions? Okay, so another quick break, and then we'll look at Marie Sharapova's serve.